A newborn stolen from a Chicago hospital, a replacement child found 2 years later, a family who believed the nightmare was finally over, until a DNA test nearly 50 years later revealed the boy they raised wasn't theirs at all. This is one of the most astonishing identity twists in American crime history. If you appreciate careful, respectful, deep-dive true crime investigations, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Crimes Unsealed. Your support helps bring long-forgotten cases back into the light. The maternity ward at Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago hummed with the familiar sounds of new life. Nurses in crisp white uniforms moved efficiently between rooms, their rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly against polished linoleum floors. Young mothers cradled their newborns, exhausted but glowing with the overwhelming joy that only a first child can bring. This was 1964. There were no CCTV cameras watching the corridors, no security bracelets locked onto tiny wrists, no electronic alarms on nursery doors. Hospitals were places of trust, open and accessible, where visitors came and went with little scrutiny. The idea that someone would walk into a maternity ward and steal a baby seemed almost unthinkable. Almost. The Fronczak family, Dora and Chester, were Polish-American, working class, and filled with hope. Dora had just given birth to their first child, a beautiful baby boy they named Paul Joseph Fronczak. For Chester, a machinist with calloused hands and a gentle heart, this moment was everything. For Dora, still recovering from labor, the weight of her newborn son in her arms felt like the answer to every prayer she'd ever whispered. The atmosphere on the maternity floor was peaceful, routine, but beneath that calm surface, something was already wrong. The day before Paul's birth, a strange woman had been seen wandering the maternity floor. She wore what appeared to be a nurse's uniform, but her behavior was odd. Lingering too long in doorways, watching mothers with their babies, asking questions that seemed just slightly out of place. Nobody questioned her, nobody stopped her, and nobody could have imagined what she was about to do. Dora sat propped up in her hospital bed, her dark hair still damp from the effort of childbirth. Baby Paul was wrapped in a standard hospital blanket, his tiny face peaceful in sleep. She traced her finger along his cheek, marveling at how impossibly soft his skin was. The nurses came in and out, congratulating the family, checking vitals, making notes on clipboards. Chester arrived with a bouquet of flowers, nothing expensive, but picked with care. He kissed his wife's forehead and stared down at his son with an expression that could only be described as awe. "He's perfect," Chester whispered. Dora smiled, exhausted but content. "He really is." It was a scene repeated in hospitals across America every single day. Ordinary, sacred, safe. For the Fronczak family, these were the last normal moments they would ever know. The woman appeared in the doorway just after 10 o'clock in the morning on April 26, 1964. She was wearing a white nurse's uniform, starched, professional, completely convincing. She carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who belonged there, someone who had walked these halls 1,000 times before. She stepped into Dora's room with a polite smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Fronczak," she said warmly. "The doctor needs to examine the baby. Just routine. I'll bring him right back." Dora didn't hesitate. Why would she? This was a hospital. These were trained professionals. This was the safest place in the world for her newborn son. She handed Paul over. The woman cradled the baby gently, professionally, and walked out of the room. Her footsteps echoed down the corridor. Then they faded, and she never came back. Minutes passed, then 10 minutes, then 20. Dora pressed the call button. A different nurse arrived, confused by Dora's questions. "What examination?" "No one ordered an examination." The blood drained from Dora's face. "Where's my baby?" The nurse's confusion turned to alarm. She rushed out of the room. Moments later, the entire maternity ward erupted into chaos. Nurses ran from room to room, checking cribs, questioning staff. The hospital administrator was summoned. Security guards, what few there were, began searching every floor. Chester arrived back at the hospital to find his wife hysterical, surrounded by hospital staff who had no answers. Within the hour, the Chicago Police Department had descended on Michael Reese Hospital. Detectives moved through the corridors, interviewing everyone who had been on shift that day. But the description they got was frustratingly vague. A woman in her 30s or 40s, average height, dark hair, wearing a nurse's uniform. It could have been anyone. Witnesses reported seeing a woman matching that description, leaving the hospital carrying a bundle. She had walked calmly to the curb, climbed into a waiting taxi, and disappeared into the sprawling maze of Chicago streets. Baby Paul Joseph Fronczak was gone. The story exploded across Chicago's newspapers within hours. Newborn stolen from hospital screamed the headlines. Photographs of baby Paul, taken just hours after his birth, were printed on front pages across the city. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The FBI took over the investigation, launching one of the most intensive searches in the agency's history. Thousands of tips poured in from across the country. Every hospital, every adoption agency, every suspicious sighting was investigated. Agents knocked on doors, questioned travelers, followed leads that stretched from coast to coast. Fake ransom calls tormented the Fronczak family. Cruel hoaxes claiming to know where Paul was. Anonymous letters demanding money. Each one was investigated. Each one led nowhere. Hospitals across America responded to the case by implementing new security measures. Nurseries were locked. Visitor access was restricted. Identification protocols were established. Baby Paul's kidnapping changed hospital policy nationwide, but none of that brought him back. Vigils were held. Prayers were offered. The Polish-American community in Chicago rallied around the Fronczak family, organizing search parties, distributing flyers, keeping hope alive. Chester and Dora appeared on television, pleading for their son's return. Dora could barely speak through her tears. Chester held her hand, his face a mask of anguish. But the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years, and still, there was no baby. The disappearance of baby Paul Fronczak destroyed Dora and Chester in ways that no one who hasn't lived through such horror could understand. Every knock on the door felt like it might be news. Every phone call could be the one. They couldn't move forward, couldn't move on, couldn't stop searching the face of every child they passed on the street, wondering, could that be him? The investigation slowed. Leads dried up. The FBI kept the case open, but active resources were redirected to new emergencies. The trail had gone completely cold. And then, in July of 1966, more than 2 years after Paul's abduction, something extraordinary happened. A toddler was found abandoned outside a department store in Newark, New Jersey. He was approximately 2 years old, with dark hair and features that seemed to match the age-progressed descriptions of Paul Fronczak. The FBI was notified immediately. The boy couldn't tell investigators his name. He had no identification, no belongings, nothing to indicate where he had come from. But he resembled the missing Fronczak baby, and the timing was right. In 1966, DNA testing as we know it today didn't exist. The most sophisticated biological testing available was blood type matching, a crude, unreliable method that could rule people out but couldn't definitively prove identity. The FBI conducted these tests. The results were inconclusive but not contradictory. The blood type matched. The age matched. The general appearance matched. Hope, desperate and overwhelming, flooded through the Fronczak family. Chester and Dora traveled to New Jersey. When they saw the little boy, their hearts broke all over again, but this time with relief instead of despair. "That's him," Dora whispered. "That's my Paul." The FBI closed the case. The boy was returned to the Fronczak family, and they all went home to Chicago to try to rebuild their shattered lives. But something was always wrong. As Paul grew up, the disconnection became impossible to ignore. He didn't look like his parents. Not really. Not the way siblings resembled each other. Not the way families just matched in subtle, indefinable ways. He felt like an outsider in his own home. The love was there. Dora and Chester adored him. But there was a strange distance, an unspoken tension that Paul couldn't name. When he was 10 years old, he was searching for something in the attic when he found a box of old newspaper clippings. Yellowed, fragile, hidden away like a secret too terrible to speak aloud. Fronczak baby stolen, FBI searches. Nationwide for kidnapped, newborn, abandoned boy returned to family. Paul read every word, his hands shaking. And for the first time, he understood. He had been kidnapped. Or maybe he hadn't. Maybe he had been abandoned. Maybe he had been someone else entirely. The cracks in his identity already forming, split wide open. Paul Joseph Fronczak, or the boy everyone called Paul, had a childhood marked by a persistent, gnawing sense of not belonging. Kids at school bullied him, mocking him because he didn't look like his parents. Family gatherings were awkward. Relatives would stare at him with expressions he couldn't quite read: pity, confusion, suspicion. Dora loved him fiercely but seemed haunted by something she would never speak about. Chester was kind but distant, as though afraid to get too close to a son who might disappear again. Paul joined the army after high school, seeking purpose and identity in structure and discipline. He moved to Nevada, married, started a life far from Chicago. But no matter how far he traveled, he couldn't escape the feeling that his entire existence was built on a lie. As an adult, Paul began asking questions. Where were his baby pictures? Why did he look so different from everyone else in the family? What really happened in 1964? His family avoided the questions. Dora would become distressed, sometimes breaking down in tears. Chester would change the subject. Relatives would grow uncomfortable and leave the room. Secrets hung over the Fronczak family like a fog, and Paul knew, deep in his bones, that the truth was something no one wanted him to discover. In 2012, Paul Joseph Fronczak made the decision that would change everything. He ordered a DNA test. The kit arrived in a plain envelope. He swabbed his cheek, sealed the sample, and mailed it back. Then he waited. For weeks, he barely slept, his mind cycling through every possible outcome. When the results arrived, Paul opened the email with trembling hands. Genetic relationship, 0% match to Dora and Chester Fronczak. You are not biologically related to the Fronczak family. The words blurred. The room spun. Paul's entire reality, every memory, every identity marker, every story he'd been told, collapsed in an instant. He wasn't Paul Fronczak. He wasn't the kidnapped baby. He wasn't even related to the people he'd called mom and dad for nearly 50 years. So who was he? The truth was even more devastating than anyone could have imagined. Paul wasn't the stolen baby. He was an abandoned child, left outside that department store in 1966, whose identity was also unknown. This wasn't one mystery. It was two. Where was the real Paul Fronczak? And who was the man who had lived his entire life under that stolen name? The revelation shattered Paul, but it also ignited something inside him, a desperate, consuming need to know who he really was. He hired genealogists. He contacted the FBI, demanding that sealed records from the original investigation be reopened. He submitted his DNA to ancestry databases, hoping for a match, any match, that would give him a name. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, pieces began to fall into place. Genetic matches pointed to a family in New Jersey, the Horan family, and as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered something that made Paul's blood run cold. In 1965, just 1 year before Paul was found abandoned, a woman named Marie Horan had given birth to twins, a boy and a girl. The girl, Jill, had disappeared, vanished without a trace. Authorities suspected foul play. They suspected Marie herself might have been involved, but no body was ever found. No charges were ever filed. And the boy? The boy had also disappeared from the Horan family's life around the same time. Paul stared at photographs of the Horan family, comparing features, searching for himself in the faces of strangers. And then the impossible became undeniable. He was that boy. He had a twin sister, Jill, who had likely been murdered. He had a mother who had abandoned him. He had lived his entire life as someone else, while his real identity was buried beneath layers of lies, trauma, and unsolved crime. But there was still another question: the search for the actual kidnapped baby, the child stolen from that Chicago hospital in 1964, continued parallel to Jack's search for his own identity. Different investigators, different genealogists, but the same burning need to know: where had that baby gone? The FBI reopened its investigation with the acknowledgement that the case had never actually been solved. They reviewed all the original evidence with fresh eyes and modern forensic techniques. They re-interviewed witnesses who were still alive, though many had died in the decades since the crime. They searched through archives and databases that hadn't existed in the 60s. Jack himself became obsessed with finding the real Paul. In some strange way, he felt responsible. He had unknowingly taken Paul's identity, had lived Paul's life, had been raised by Paul's parents. The least he could do was help find the person whose place he'd occupied for nearly 50 years. More DNA testing, more genealogical research, more building of family trees and tracking of genetic markers, and eventually, incredibly, another breakthrough. In 2013, after months of intensive investigation, the genealogists believed they had found him. The real Paul Joseph Fronczak, the baby stolen from Michael Reese Hospital on April 27, 1964, was alive. He was living in Michigan using a completely different name, raised by a family that had no idea they were raising a kidnapped child. He was approximately the same age as Jack, having lived his entire life believing he was someone else entirely. His family, the people who raised him, had acquired him through what they believed was a legitimate, if informal, private adoption back in the mid-1960s. They had been told the baby's mother couldn't care for him and wanted him placed with a good family. No official paperwork, no agencies involved, just a private arrangement facilitated by someone they trusted. They had never suspected that the baby they brought home was actually stolen. They had never imagined they were participating in a kidnapping, even unknowingly. They loved him, raised him, gave him a good life, completely unaware of the crime that had made it possible. When investigators approached this man, now in his late 40s, and told him that DNA evidence suggested he was actually Paul Joseph Fronczak, kidnapped from a Chicago hospital as a newborn, his reaction was similar to Jack's had been. Shock, disbelief, horror. The complete collapse of everything he'd believed about his identity and origins. More DNA testing confirmed the connection. He was genetically related to Dora and Chester Fronczak. The odds were overwhelming that he was their biological son, the baby stolen nearly 50 years earlier. The real Paul Fronczak had been found. But like Jack, he had lived his entire life with the wrong identity, the wrong name, the wrong family story. He had his own parents now, the people who raised him, and confronting the truth meant potentially destroying relationships and family bonds built over decades. It was a situation with no good outcomes, no clean resolutions, no way to undo the damage that had been done. Two men, two stolen identities, two families torn apart by a crime committed in 1964 by a woman whose identity remained unknown, whose motivations were never fully understood, who had set in motion a cascade of consequences that destroyed multiple lives across generations. Jack Rosenthal, who had lived as Paul Fronczak. Paul Fronczak, who had lived as someone else entirely. Jill Rosenthal, who had died without justice, without acknowledgement, without anyone even looking for her until it was far too late. Dora and Chester Fronczak, who had lost their biological son and unknowingly raised someone else's abandoned child, loving him fiercely but never fully connecting because the fundamental truth was hidden from everyone. The family who raised the real Paul, guilty of no crime but forever associated with a kidnapping they never knew occurred. Marie Horan, who had abandoned one child and likely murdered another, and who faced no legal consequences because too much time had passed, too much evidence had been lost, and the legal system couldn't reach back across decades to deliver justice. And the woman who walked into that hospital in 1964, who disguised herself as a nurse and stole a newborn from his mother's arms, her identity remained unknown. She was never found, never caught, never held accountable for setting all of this in motion. What makes us who we are? The question seems simple on its surface, but this case exposes the profound complexity lurking beneath. Are we defined by our DNA, by the genetic code written into every cell of our bodies? Are we products of our biology, our inherited traits, our family history encoded in chromosomes? Or are we shaped by the people who raised us, by the love given and received over a lifetime, by the memories built and the experiences shared? Is family the people we're born to, or the people who choose us and whom we choose in return? For Jack Rosenthal, the man who grew up as Paul Fronczak, the answer is impossibly complicated. He discovered that his entire identity was built on a foundation that wasn't real. that the name he'd carried for 48 years didn't belong to him, that his birth certificate was a lie, and his family tree was fiction. But does that erase the love? Does it invalidate the life he lived? Dora and Chester raised him. They fed him and clothed him and sent him to school. They worried about him and celebrated his achievements and mourned his disappointments. They were his parents in every way that mattered, except the biological one. Was their love less real because it was based on a mistaken identity? Did it count for less because he wasn't genetically theirs? Most people who know this story would say no. Love isn't diminished by the absence of genetic connection. Family can be built on choice and commitment rather than blood. The Fronczaks loved the boy they called Paul, and that love was genuine even if the identity was wrong. But Jack himself struggled with this question for years after learning the truth. He had spent his entire childhood feeling like he didn't belong, sensing something was wrong, unable to connect fully with the family that raised him. Was that because of the genetic disconnect? Or was it because, on some unconscious level, everyone involved knew the truth, even if they couldn't articulate it? Would he have felt differently if he'd been told from the beginning? If Dora and Chester had acknowledged the uncertainty about his identity, if they'd raised him with the knowledge that he might not be their biological son, would that have changed anything? We'll never know. The Fronczaks made a choice, conscious or unconscious, to accept the FBI's conclusion in 1966, to believe that the abandoned child was their stolen son, to never question it too deeply because questioning meant reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. Was that choice made out of love, out of desperation, out of denial? Probably all of those things tangled together in ways that even Dora and Chester themselves might not have been able to untangle. And what about the real Paul Fronczak, the man who lived his entire life as someone else, raised by a family who believed they'd adopted him legitimately, never knowing he'd been stolen from a hospital as a newborn? His identity was just as thoroughly stolen as Jack's, but in a different direction. He was denied the chance to know his biological parents, to grow up in the family and culture he was born into, to live the life that should have been his. But he also grew up loved, in a family that wanted him, with parents who chose to raise him even though they didn't have to. If they had known he was kidnapped, they would have returned him immediately. At least we must assume so, must hope so. But they didn't know. They were victims too, in a sense, manipulated into participating in a crime they never would have willingly committed. When the truth finally came out, the real Paul had to make impossible choices. Should he try to build a relationship with Dora and Chester, the biological parents he'd never known? They were elderly by then, strangers really, connected to him only by genetics in a crime committed decades ago. Should he reject the family who raised him, blame them for something they didn't know they'd done? How could he? They were his parents in every meaningful sense, even if biology said otherwise. There's no good answer, no resolution that makes everyone whole. Identity, once shattered, can be pieced back together, but the cracks always show. This case reveals the devastating cost of secrecy. Dora and Chester kept their doubts, if they had doubts, locked away. They never told the boy they raised about the kidnapping until he found those newspaper clippings on his own. They avoided conversations about identity and origins, deflecting questions, changing subjects, building walls of silence around a truth that everyone sensed but no one would speak. What if they'd been honest from the beginning? What if they'd said, "We don't know for certain that you're our biological son, but we love you completely and you'll always be our child"? Would that have prevented decades of confusion and disconnection? Would it have allowed Jack to understand himself better? To not spend his childhood feeling like an alien in his own family? Again, we can't know. But the secrecy clearly caused harm. It created an atmosphere where questions couldn't be asked and doubts couldn't be acknowledged. It forced everyone to live with ambiguity disguised as certainty, to perform normalcy when nothing felt normal. The long shadow cast by unresolved trauma stretched across generations. Dora and Chester never recovered from losing their baby in 1964. That wound never healed, and it shaped every relationship they had afterward, including their relationship with the boy they raised. They couldn't help but compare him to the infant they'd lost. couldn't help but look for their biological son in the face of the child they were raising. And the trauma was passed down. Jack grew up feeling like he didn't belong, like something fundamental was wrong with his identity, and that sense of disconnection shaped his personality, his relationships, his entire approach to life. He joined the military partially to escape a family that didn't feel like his. He moved across the country to put distance between himself and a past that didn't make sense. Trauma echoes. It ripples outward, affecting people who weren't even present for the original crime. Marie Horan's children, twins who should have had each other, who should have grown up together, were separated by death and abandonment. Jill's murder was never solved, never prosecuted. Jack was left to wonder about the sister he never knew, to grieve for a relationship that was stolen from him before he was old enough to remember. DNA gave these men answers when all other avenues of investigation had failed. Modern genetic science made it possible to solve a crime that had stumped investigators for decades, to untangle identities that had been confused for nearly 50 years. But answers don't undo damage. They don't give back the childhoods that were stolen. They don't resurrect the dead or heal wounds that have festered for decades. Jack Rosenthal learned his real name, but he lived nearly 50 years as Paul Fronczak. Which identity was more real? The one written in his DNA or the one written in his memories? The real Paul Fronczak learned about his biological origins, but he'd spent his entire life as someone else. He had parents who raised him, siblings he grew up with, a name and identity that felt like his own, even if genetics said otherwise. Both men had to figure out how to reconcile biology with experience, how to honor the families that raised them while acknowledging the families they were born into. Both had to construct new identities from the fragments of shattered old ones. And both had to live with the knowledge that their lives had been shaped by crimes they had no control over, by decisions made by people they'd never met, by secrets and lies that predated their ability to remember. The case of Paul Fronczak, or rather the case of Jack Rosenthal, and the real Paul Fronczak and Jill Rosenthal, and all the families whose lives were destroyed by events set in motion in 1964, reminds us that some mysteries, even when solved, leave wounds that never fully close. Justice was never really achieved. The woman who stole a baby from that Chicago hospital was never caught. Marie Horan faced no legal consequences for abandoning Jack or for whatever happened to Jill. Too much time had passed. Evidence was lost or destroyed. Witnesses died or forgot. The legal system, designed to handle contemporary crimes, couldn't reach back across 5 decades to deliver accountability. The only thing that was achieved was truth. Partial truth, incomplete truth. Truth that raised as many questions as it answered, but truth nonetheless. Jack Rosenthal knows who he is now. The real Paul Fronczak knows where he came from. The families involved understand what happened, even if they can't undo it. And perhaps that's all we can hope for in cases like this. Not justice, not healing, not restoration of what was lost, just truth. The bare acknowledgement of what actually happened, stripped of the lies and secrets and false identities that obscured it for so long. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's something. Even with all the investigation, all the DNA testing, all the genealogical research and FBI resources and media attention, significant questions remain unanswered about this case. Who was the woman who walked into Michael Reese Hospital on April 27, 1964? She was never identified, never caught, never held accountable. Investigators have theories. Perhaps she was a woman who had lost a baby of her own and, driven by grief and mental illness, stole someone else's to fill the void. Perhaps she was part of a black market baby ring, stealing infants to sell to couples desperate to adopt. Perhaps she had been hired by someone to procure a baby, though who and why remain mysteries. Security camera footage from the hospital doesn't exist. Cameras weren't installed until years after the crime. The descriptions provided by witnesses were too vague to be useful. A woman in a nurse's uniform could have been thousands of people in Chicago at that time. She planned the crime carefully, spending the day before Paul's birth wandering the maternity ward, observing routines, selecting her target. She executed it with confidence and calm, walking out of the hospital with a stolen baby, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She disappeared completely, leaving no trail for investigators to follow. Did she keep baby Paul? Did she sell him to the family who eventually raised him? Did she hand him off to accomplices? Was she the one who facilitated the private adoption that placed the real Paul with his eventual family? We don't know. We may never know. What exactly happened to Jill Rosenthal? The twin sister Jack never knew. The little girl who disappeared from Marie Horan's home when she was less than a year old. Investigators strongly suspect she was murdered. The circumstances of her disappearance, combined with evidence of neglect and abuse in the household, point toward a tragic ending. But her remains were never found. No physical evidence was ever recovered. Marie Horan claimed she didn't know what happened, and without a body or witnesses, prosecutors couldn't build a case against her. Was Jill buried somewhere, hidden in a location that will never be discovered? Or did something else happen, something we can't even imagine because the full truth was never revealed? Jack thinks about his sister often, the twin he should have known, should have grown up with, should have had a lifetime of memories with. Instead, he has nothing, not even a grave to visit, just the knowledge that she existed briefly and then was gone, erased as thoroughly as if she'd never been born. Why did Marie Horan abandon Jack? She claims she gave him up for adoption because she couldn't handle raising a child alone after her husband left. But there were no official adoption records. She simply abandoned him outside a department store, left him to be found by strangers, walked away from her own son without looking back. Was she afraid of being charged with child abuse or murder in connection with Jill's disappearance? Was abandoning Jack a way to get rid of evidence? To eliminate the possibility that someone might notice she'd had twins and now only had one child? Or was it something else? Mental illness? Desperation? The complete inability to cope with the responsibilities of parenthood? We don't know what was going through her mind. She never gave a coherent explanation. And by the time investigators caught up with her, decades later, she was old and evasive, offering nothing but denials and refusals to discuss the past. How did baby Paul end up with the family who raised him? This is perhaps the most troubling unanswered question. We know the family believed they were participating in a legitimate private adoption. They were good people by all accounts, who had no idea they were raising a kidnapped child. But who arranged that adoption? Who connected the woman who stole baby Paul with the family looking to adopt? How much money changed hands? What lies were told to make the adoption seem legitimate? There must have been an intermediary, someone who knew the baby was stolen but facilitated his placement with a new family anyway. Someone who operated in the shadows of the black market adoption world, profiting from the desperation of childless couples and the vulnerability of stolen or coerced infants. That person was never identified. The chain of custody from Michael Reese Hospital to the family who raised Paul remains murky, incomplete, full of gaps that investigators couldn't fill even with modern resources. Could the hospital have prevented the kidnapping? This question haunted hospital administrators and security experts for decades after the crime. In 1964, hospital security was virtually non-existent. Maternity wards were open and accessible. Anyone could walk in wearing what appeared to be a nurse's uniform, and no one would question them. Should they have? Could reasonable security measures have stopped the kidnapping without turning hospitals into fortresses that would have disrupted the care of patients? The answer is complicated. Yes, better security would likely have prevented this specific crime. Requiring ID badges, restricting access to maternity wards, implementing better procedures for tracking infants. But implementing those measures required imagining that someone would do something as unthinkable as stealing a newborn from its mother. It required accepting that hospitals were vulnerable in ways no one wanted to acknowledge. The Fronczak kidnapping changed hospital policy nationwide. The security measures we now take for granted, the locked nurseries, the infant tracking bracelets, the restricted access, most of them were implemented in direct response to this case and others like it. But those changes came too late for baby Paul and for all the other children who were stolen before the system adapted to protect them. In the years since the truth came out, the people involved in this case have had to figure out how to move forward with shattered identities and reconstructed family trees. Jack Rosenthal, the man who grew up as Paul Fronczak, has had to reconcile his biological identity with the life he actually lived. He still goes by Paul in many contexts, because that's the name he's known for nearly 50 years, the name his friends and colleagues know him by. But he also acknowledges his birth name, his connection to the Horan family, his identity as Jack. He's conflicted about Marie Horan, the biological mother who abandoned him. Part of him wants to understand her, to know what drove her to make the choices she made. Part of him is angry at her for robbing him of his twin sister, for the neglect and abuse that characterized his earliest life, for the abandonment that set him on the path that led to decades of identity confusion. He never had the chance to meet Jill, to know his twin. That loss haunts him in a particular way. Not grief for someone he knew, but grief for a relationship that should have existed and never had the chance to form. His relationship with Dora and Chester Fronczak remained complicated until their deaths. They loved him. That was never in question. But the revelation that he wasn't their biological son reopened wounds that had never fully healed from the original kidnapping. The elderly couple had to confront the reality that they'd raised someone else's abandoned child while their own son grew up elsewhere, never knowing them. Did they regret the years they spent raising Jack? No one who knew them believes that, but the situation was heartbreaking in its complexity. Layers of loss piled on top of each other with no clear resolution. The real Paul Fronczak, the man who was actually kidnapped as a newborn, faced his own difficult choices about identity and family. He had been raised by people who loved him, who believed they'd adopted him legitimately through informal channels that were more common in the 1960s than they are today. Should he reject them because they'd unknowingly participated in a crime? Should he build a relationship with Dora and Chester, the biological parents he'd never known? He chose to maintain his relationship with the family who raised him, while also cautiously connecting with his biological origins. It wasn't an either-or situation, though it was emotionally exhausting to navigate. He had two sets of parents in a sense, the people who gave him life and the people who gave him a childhood. He chose to keep the name he grew up with rather than reclaiming Paul Fronczak. That identity belonged to someone else now, to Jack, who had lived with it for 5 decades. The real Paul had his own identity, his own life, his own name that felt more authentic to him than the one on his original birth certificate. Both men, Jack and the real Paul, became advocates for adoptees' rights and for better record-keeping in adoption cases. They spoke publicly about their experiences, hoping to prevent similar situations, hoping to help other people who might be living with unknown or mistaken identities. They developed a complicated relationship with each other, not quite friends, not quite brothers, but connected by the strange twist of fate that had intertwined their lives. They were both victims of crimes they had no control over, both survivors of identity theft in the most literal sense, both men trying to make sense of origins that defied simple explanation. The Fronczak case is not unique. It's dramatic and particularly well documented, but it's part of a larger pattern of baby trafficking, illegal adoptions, and identity theft that characterized much of the mid-20th century in America and around the world. In the 1950s and 60s, before modern adoption laws and regulations were fully implemented, a thriving black market existed for babies. Unwed mothers were pressured or coerced into giving up their children. Poor families were told their babies had died when they had actually been sold to wealthy couples. Babies were stolen from hospitals and sold through networks of corrupt doctors, lawyers, and adoption facilitators. The demand was enormous. Couples struggling with infertility were desperate to adopt, and legitimate adoption agencies often had waiting lists that stretched for years. The black market offered a faster, simpler path, if you were willing to pay and not ask too many questions about where the baby came from. Many people who were adopted during this era, particularly through private adoptions arranged outside the formal agency system, have no idea whether their adoptions were legitimate or whether they were stolen or coerced from their birth families. Modern DNA testing has begun to unravel some of these cases. People who always knew they were adopted are discovering that the stories they were told about their origins don't match genetic reality. Others, like Jack Rosenthal, are discovering they were adopted without ever being told. Their entire identities built on foundations that weren't real. The emotional and psychological toll is enormous. Identity is fundamental to how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. When that identity is revealed to be false or mistaken, it creates a crisis that's difficult for anyone who hasn't experienced it to fully comprehend. Support groups have formed for people dealing with these issues. Adoptees who discovered the truth late in life, people who found out they were donor-conceived without their knowledge, individuals whose identities were stolen or switched at birth. The common thread is the shattering of foundational beliefs about who you are and where you came from. The Fronczak case has become something of a touchstone in these communities, a dramatic example of how thoroughly identity can be disrupted and how difficult it is to reconstruct a coherent sense of self when the basic facts of your origin turn out to be wrong. It has also prompted calls for better record-keeping and more transparency in adoption systems. Many states still have laws that seal adoption records, preventing adoptees from accessing information about their birth families, even as adults. Advocates argue that this secrecy protects traffickers and enables continued deception, and they point to cases like Fronczak's as evidence that transparency and truth should be prioritized over privacy concerns. None of this would have been discovered without modern DNA testing. The technology to definitively determine biological relationships didn't exist in 1966 when the wrong child was returned to the Fronczak family. Blood type matching was the best available method, and it was woefully inadequate, able to rule people out but unable to prove identity with any certainty. Jack Rosenthal lived nearly 50 years with a mistaken identity because the technology to reveal the truth didn't exist for most of his life. If DNA testing had been available in the 60s, the error would have been caught immediately. The abandoned child found in Newark would have been tested against Dora and Chester's DNA. The lack of genetic connection would have been immediately apparent, and the real Paul would have been found much sooner, assuming he could have been found at all. DNA testing became commercially available in the early 2000s, and its impact on cold cases and identity mysteries has been revolutionary. Crimes that were unsolvable with traditional investigative techniques can now be cracked by genetic genealogy. Identities that were confused or stolen can be clarified with certainty that earlier generations couldn't achieve. The same technology that freed innocent people from prison by proving they couldn't have committed the crimes they were convicted of, the same technology that caught serial killers decades after their crimes by matching DNA from old crime scenes to genetic profiles in ancestry databases. That technology also gave Jack Rosenthal and the real Paul Fronczak the truth about who they were. But the truth came with a price. Jack spent 5 decades feeling like he didn't belong, sensing something was wrong but unable to identify what. The real Paul spent his entire life living a lie without knowing it. Dora and Chester raised a child who wasn't theirs while their actual son grew up elsewhere. If DNA testing had existed from the beginning, would it have prevented any of this pain? Or would it simply have revealed the truth sooner, creating different but equally difficult challenges for everyone involved? There's no clear answer. Technology can reveal truth, but it can't heal the wounds created by that truth. It can provide answers, but it can't undo the damage caused by decades of not knowing. The Fronczak case demonstrates both the power and the limitations of modern forensic science. DNA gave everyone involved the answers they desperately needed, but those answers came too late to save anyone from years of confusion, disconnection, and identity crisis. The kidnapping of baby Paul Fronczak in 1964 was a watershed moment in hospital security and child protection policies. The ease with which a woman could walk into a maternity ward, claim to be a nurse, and walk out with a stolen baby shocked the nation and forced institutions to confront vulnerabilities they'd never seriously considered. In the immediate aftermath of the kidnapping, hospitals across America began implementing new security measures. Infant identification systems became standard. Babies received ID bracelets immediately after birth, with matching bracelets given to mothers. Staff were trained to check these bracelets before moving infants anywhere, ensuring that babies couldn't be handed off to the wrong person by mistake or by deliberate theft. Locked nurseries replaced the open, accessible wards that had been standard in earlier decades. Visitors could no longer wander freely through maternity floors. Access points were restricted and monitored, Staff identification protocols were strengthened. Hospital employees were required to wear visible ID badges. Anyone without proper identification was challenged and escorted out. The days of allowing anyone in a white uniform to move unchecked through hospital corridors were over. Visitor policies were tightened significantly. Hospitals began restricting who could enter maternity wards and when. Visiting hours were established and enforced. Non-family members were often prohibited from certain areas entirely. Electronic monitoring systems were developed specifically to prevent infant abduction. Modern hospitals use tracking bracelets that trigger alarms if a baby is taken beyond authorized areas. Some systems lock down exits automatically if an infant approaches them without proper authorization. Staff training now includes specific protocols for infant security. Nurses and other hospital workers are trained to recognize suspicious behavior, to challenge anyone who seems out of place, to never allow a baby to leave with someone they can't verify has authorization. These measures are now so standard that it's difficult to imagine hospitals operating without them. But they didn't exist before cases like the Fronczak kidnapping forced institutions to acknowledge their vulnerability and take action to protect the patients in their care. The improvements have been effective. Hospital infant abductions, while they still occasionally occur, are far less common than they were in the 1960s. The systems put in place to prevent these crimes have saved countless families from experiencing the nightmare the Fronczaks lived through. But those improvements came too late for baby Paul, too late for Jack Rosenthal, too late for all the families whose lives were destroyed by crimes that could have been prevented if the security measures had existed earlier. The kidnapping of baby Paul Joseph Fronczak in 1964 changed hospital security forever, prompted improvements in adoption regulations, and eventually became one of the most complex identity cases in American history. But those policy changes and legal reforms couldn't undo what had already been done. Two boys grew up in the wrong lives, one living with a family that wasn't his, the other placed through illegal channels with parents who didn't know they were raising a kidnapped child. One family lost a son and unknowingly raised someone else's abandoned baby, loving him completely but never quite connecting because the fundamental truth was hidden from everyone. Another family raised a stolen child, guilty of no crime but forever marked by their unknowing participation in a kidnapping. A little girl named Jill Rosenthal disappeared into the darkness, her voice silenced forever, her death unsolved and likely unpunished, her twin brother left to grieve for a relationship that never had the chance to exist. And a woman in a white nurse's uniform, the person who set all of this in motion, walked out of Michael Reese Hospital on April 27, 1964, carrying a stolen newborn, and vanished so completely that 50 years of investigation couldn't find her. This is the story of the child found. Who wasn't the child? It's a story about identity, how fragile it is, how easily it can be stolen or confused, how fundamentally it shapes everything about how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. It's a story about family, what that word really means, whether it's defined by biology or by love, how relationships can survive even the most devastating revelations or fracture under the weight of secrets that were kept too long. It's a story about truth, the pain of not knowing, the courage required to seek answers even when you're terrified of what you might find, the aftermath of discovery when truth brings more questions than resolution. And it's a story about crime, not just the original kidnapping, but the cascading series of secondary crimes and deceptions that followed, the illegal adoption networks that operated in the shadows, the abandonment of children, the possible murder of an infant girl, all of it unpunished and largely unsolved. And it's a reminder that some mysteries, even when solved, leave wounds that never fully close, that knowing the truth doesn't automatically heal the damage caused by not knowing. That identity, once shattered, can be pieced back together, but the cracks always remain visible. Jack Rosenthal learned his real name, but he'd lived nearly 50 years as Paul Fronczak. Both identities are real in their own way, one written in DNA, the other written in memory and experience. The real Paul Fronczak learned where he came from, but he'd spent his entire life as someone else, with a family he loved and a name that felt like his own, even if genetics said otherwise. Neither man got back what was stolen from them. Neither man got to live the life he should have had, but both got something that had been denied them for decades: the truth about who they really were. It's not justice, it's not closure, it's not healing, but it's something. And sometimes, in cases as complicated and heartbreaking as this one, truth is all we can hope to achieve. If this story moved you, if you found yourself drawn into the mystery and heartbreak of these intertwined lives, if you believe that forgotten cases and stolen identities deserve to be brought back into the light, please like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us how this case affected you. Discuss the questions it raises about identity, family, truth, and the long shadow cast by crimes committed decades ago. And please subscribe to Crimes Unsealed. Your support helps give these forgotten children, Paul Fronczak, Jack Rosenthal, Jill Rosenthal, all the babies stolen or trafficked or disappeared, the voice they never had. It helps ensure that their stories aren't lost to time, that the truth continues to be told even when it's uncomfortable or complicated. Cases like this one remind us why this work matters, why we dig into old files and chase down leads that others have abandoned, why we use modern technology to solve crimes that were thought unsolvable, why we refuse to let victims be forgotten just because time has passed and memories have faded. Every cold case represents a life disrupted, a family destroyed, a truth buried beneath layers of deception and confusion. Every solved mystery, even when the solution brings more pain than comfort, represents justice of a kind, acknowledgement that these lives mattered, these crimes occurred, these truths deserve to be known. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about these stories. Thank you for being part of a community that believes in truth and justice, even when both seem impossibly distant. And as always, stay safe out there, because the world is more complicated, more dangerous, and more full of heartbreaking mysteries than most of us ever want to believe. But it's also full of people like you, people who care, people who remember, people who refuse to let the forgotten stay lost. And that gives us hope.